Hi everyone, Stepan here. Today I'm going to do the last video in the Alekhine defense series, and we are going to do the modern defense, which is also considered to be the main line, and it's the most popular way for white to play. We've already been over the 4 pawns attack and the exchange variations, which are in my opinion two of the best ways for white to play, and today we are going to go over setups with knight to f3 for white, so quite different to what we've been looking at so far. Before I start, thanks very much for the support, for the kind comments and emails and everything. That really means a lot to me. Okay, so pawn to e4, knight to f6, the Alekhine defense by black, e5, knight to d5, d4, d6. If you haven't seen the introductory video on the Alekhine, please do. I explain the opening moves in that video. And so today we are going to go over knight to f3. So far we've been looking at the move c4, bishop c4, and the other lines which branch out from that. And today knight to f3, which is the modern variation, sometimes called the main line also. Now, the move knight to f3 has one clear purpose in this variation, and the idea behind knight to f3 is that white is trying to develop while at the same time keeping an eye on his biggest weakness in the position, the overextended e5 pawn. In the Alekhine defense after knight to f6, e5, white's e5 pawn is sort of a liability, and if it doesn't get exchanged off, then black will often base his play around that pawn, as we are going to see in some variations here. And the knight on f3 comes in handy because if white continues developing normally and black captures on e5, which often happens, then white can simply recapture with the knight, not having to recapture with the d4 pawn and then still leave himself with the weakness on e5. So the move knight to f3 is a good idea, and it serves a great purpose, but it comes with a downside. In many other variations of the Alekhine, like the exchange variation or the 4 pawns attack and some other lines, white will delay developing of his knight to the f3 square, because when the knight is on f3, the black bishop from c8 has a good square. The bishop can come to g4, which is the main line here in the modern variation. And if you don't develop your knight to f3, then bishop g4 is a silly move because it can be captured. Or in some variations, white responds with pawn to f3, as we saw in the last video. So knight to f3 is positively inviting bishop to g4, a square for the piece which usually doesn't have a comfortable way to develop. So knight to f3 serves a purpose for white, defends the e5 pawn, but it also gives black a normal developing move. We're going to look at several options black has. We're going to look at 5 different moves. Bishop g4 is the main line. D takes c5 is the Larson variation, g6 fianchettoing in the Albert variation, sort of going for a different setup. Knight b6 is a strange move, just retreating the knight in anticipation of c4, and c6 is a sideline which we are going to cover briefly, which mainly transposes to bishop to g4. So okay, let's look at the main line first, bishop to g4. I think this is the most sensible way for black to play, because you are using the biggest downside of white's 4th move, knight to f3, so why not use that? Bishop g4. White now has only one move basically, bishop to e2. If you don't play bishop to e2, then d takes e5. D takes e5 is strategically better for black because, as I said, you are left with a weakness on e5. So bishop to e2. Black has 2 moves here. One move is c6, one move is e6. Taking here doesn't really do much because knight takes, and that's not a move. c6 is the second most popular move, defending the knight. And after c6, white has 2 ways to play. The main line is sort of strange in my opinion, and I would recommend another move, but we are going to look at the main line, and that's castles. After castles, black wants to create this weakness so badly that he is prepared to give up his bishop pair. So bishop takes f3, and now d takes e5. White is forced to recapture with the pawn, and now e6. I like this variation for black because he has a Caro-Kann pawn structure, which is my favorite, and I know how to play with it. And he got rid of his bad c8 bishop. So this pawn formation is very solid for black. And if white goes for the modern variation, then black is going to have a solid pawn structure. If he manages to exchange the pawn, the bishop, and if he manages to leave this pawn on e5, then even though the engines say it's better for white, I think black has a lot of play in the position. This sideline with c6 is called the floor variation. And now after e6, queen to e2 defending the pawn, knight to d7 attacking the pawn, c4, knight to e7. There are two ways to play here. You can either play b3 or you can play knight to c3. In both cases, this pawn is going to either be hanging or it's going to be lost. After knight c3, which is the move I prefer, queen c7, double attacking the pawn, bishop f4 defending, knight g6, bishop g3, black can't really capture the pawn here because even though he has three attackers, because if knight g takes e5, rook a to d1 should be played, and now the knight is pinned. White is simply threatening to take on d7. So the move is knight takes f3, queen to d8, getting away from the glare of the bishop, and after knight to e4, white is better. But in the other variation, where after bishop to g3, black doesn't take the pawn, but simply keeps the pressure in the position, develops the bishop and castles, or castles queenside, black has a lot of play. This pawn is inevitably going to be weak throughout the game, and even if it's not captured, black is playing against this silly g3 bishop. So I really don't like this variation. The other line after knight to e7 is for white to play the move b3, and then he just loses the pawn. So knight g6, double attacking the pawn, bishop b2. Black can't capture yet, but after queen c7, g3, knight d5, bishop g2, castles, knight c3. White has 6 pawns, black has 7 pawns. The engine thinks it's equal, but I think black is better. The bishop pair isn't really worth that much in this position. I think that the pawn is more important. So coming back to this position after bishop to e2, c6, castles might be the main line, but if you have to accept either losing this pawn or having it blocking your bishop on g3, then I would avoid that. The move I would recommend, which isn't the main move but it's much more pleasant, is getting rid of your weakness, because you have to be aware that black will give up his bishop on f3. So the move here is e takes d6, and after e takes d6, castle now, and black doesn't have the option of capturing on e5. Now black can't really take the knight on f3 because it makes no sense. Black will have to continue developing. Bishop e7, h3 chase the bishop, bishop e6, c4 chase the knight, knight c7, bishop d3 develop normally, and castles. And in this position, white has a huge advantage. The engine thinks this is plus 1.5. I don't understand why this isn't the main line. Let's go over it once more. So knight f3, the modern variation, bishop g4, the main line, bishop to e2. If black plays c6, which is the second most common move, I wouldn't recommend castling because of the reasons I already mentioned. Just exchange your weakness and then castle, and you're going to have a better position. You have better pieces. You are slightly down on development on the queen side, but you have already castled. The bishop on g4 doesn't really look that good anymore, and white is simply better. Even the engine thinks this is plus 1 or more. So a good position. The main line for black to avoid all of this is e6, which is a better move. Now once again, you can castle. Taking the pawn is slightly different in this position because after e6 it could sometimes transpose to the same positions, but usually it doesn't. E takes d6 is better for black, or a draw. Now after e takes d6, c takes d6, black is able to recapture with the c pawn, and that makes a huge difference. Because after c6, once you take here, black can't really take with the c pawn anymore, and after e6, if e takes d6, c takes d6, now this gives the option of to black to either play f5 and e5, or just play e5, opening up your center, and black will have a slight advantage and more control in the center. So after e6, you can't really play that. So the move after e6 is castles or c4. Castles is the main line, c4 is slightly more aggressive, c4, knight b6, e d6, c d6, castles, bishop e7, knight c3, and in most variations where black manages to recapture with the c pawn, white is going to stand better, but it's nothing major and black has a lot of play. He has play along the semi-open c-file, he's going to castle, and he doesn't have any problems. In fact, I would say that black's bishops are more active than white's bishops, but white's knights are better. The engines give it a slightly better for white, plus 1, but that's over-exaggerated, I think. So after e6, c4 might be pushing it, so castle first, and then play c4 later on. Castle, bishop to e7, now c4, knight b6, knight c3, castle. And now, if you don't take on d6, then black could perhaps go for the same variation, bishop f3, and then taking, creating a weakness on e5. So ed6, cd6 is the main move, and you end up in the same position transposing, but I would still recommend you castle first. So this is the setup in the main line of the modern variation. This pawn, sort of Sicilian pawn center for black, is going to be thematic, and white is going to have a queen's pawn opening pawn setup with c4, d4, knight c3, knight f3, bishop e2. And I mean, white's plans are to attack along this diagonal, because black obviously doesn't have the knight on f6 in the Alekhine defense, so this is one of the major weaknesses in the position. So this is for the move bishop g4. After bishop e2, e6 or c6. After c6, as I said, just exchange the pawn. After e6, castle and continue normally. c4, knight c3, and continue from there. The second move I would like to look at is d takes c5, the Larson variation. And now, of course, you don't capture with the d-pawn. You don't leave yourself with a weakness. If you take with the d-pawn, bishop g4, h3, bishop f3, queen f3, e6, black is once again going to be able to create his strong pawn structure and put pressure on your weakness on e5, so that doesn't really make sense. So if the Larson variation is played, take with the knight. c6 is the main move for black. He can also go for g6 setup, c4, knight b6, knight c3, bishop g7, but I wouldn't really recommend those. I think it's slightly strange to play fianchetto variations with your knight on b6. I think white will often manage to play bishop e3, queen d2, exchange the bishops and create an attack, even castle queenside. So after knight takes c5 in the Larson variation, I would recommend c6. White continues normal development, bishop to e2, bishop f5, castles, knight d7, knight f3. You don't really want to retreat. You don't really want to exchange the knight on d7. You retreat because your knight is a good defender. e6, creating his pawn structure. And I like this variation for black because it resembles the Caro-Kann a lot. And you are often going to have pawns on c6 and d6, and I'm very comfortable with these positions, so I understand them better. And I don't see how this is much better for white, but the engine basically gives every variation as +1 or almost +1. c4 is one of the main ideas, but you can, after black creates this setup, you can also go for a kingside attack with c3, bishop f4 or bishop e3 and knight to d2, but that's slightly more passive. And after c4, in an ideal world, you would like to push through with d5, and if you manage to get d5 in, that's great. Many attacking ideas in this variation involve playing rook to e1 and playing d5 while the king is still in the center, so that's one of the attacking plans using this pin. But as I said, nothing major. Black has this solid structure which is hard to break through. Another move is just going for the fianchetto for black, the Albert variation, just g6. Here, white should continue with bishop to c4, combining a few variations, combining some ideas from the Balog variation, because now it's sort of awkward for black to play, and we are going to see some very dangerous lines which white could go for. So knight b6 is the main move. You have to move the knight. If black plays e6 or c6, then white just takes. Bishop to b3, moving away from the attack. Once again, resembles the Caro-Kann, but in reverse. Bishop g7. And now there's a very aggressive move for white. And this is why I like this variation, and this is why I don't like this variation for black. After g6, white always has the option of jumping his knight into g5, and that's exactly what white should do here. There's another variation with a4, a5, but I wouldn't recommend that. After bishop g7, play knight to g5. And now, black could easily go wrong. You might think that castles is the main move, but it actually loses. You can play d5, and after d5, white should play f4. You have to block out the bishop. And the main move after knight to g5 is actually e6. Blocking out the bishop once again. If after knight to g5, black castles, then white has a huge advantage after e6. And you can't really take. I mean, it's very dangerous to take this pawn. The best idea is f6, just blocking it out. And now knight to f7. Queen to e8, the queen was attacked. Knight to h6 check, king to h8, d5, and this is a very dangerous pawn structure. Strategically, won for white, and black has no space to develop. So after knight to g5, make sure that you don't castle, even though usually in the Italian, when knight to f6 is knight to g5 is played, if you can castle, then that's great. In this position, it doesn't really work because the pawn is already on e5. So after knight g5, play e6, queen to f3, putting more pressure on the f7 pawn. Castles is okay now. Queen to h3, provoking this pawn. h6, knight to f3, now the pawn is attacked twice. D takes e5. D takes c5, taking on h6 doesn't work, you have to recapture. c5, not giving time to capture here once more because your bishop is hanging. c3, and now h5 defending, castles. And I think this variation is fairly pleasant for white because even though black has defended everything, his bishop is sort of out of play because of the e5 pawn, which is a liability, but not that big of a liability. White always has bishop g5 to develop with tempo. White can play knight b to d2, knight to e4, jumping into f6. So there are a lot of attacking ideas for white, and at the same time, this bishop is looking at its own pawn, this bishop is blocked in, and I really, from a human perspective, don't like this variation for black. So after knight to f3, g6, the Albert variation, I wouldn't recommend. It might be a fun idea to try out, but if white knows what he is doing, you are going to be worse. Okay, knight b6, well, the sort of cowardly variation moving in anticipation of c4, I mean, this guy Schmidt probably wasn't too brave, I don't know. I wouldn't recommend this for black. White has several options, one of them is bishop to e2, after which black fianchettos, and ed6, cd6, c4. Once again a queen's pawn setup for white, Sicilian pawn structure for black. White holds a slight edge, black should play along the open c file, and white should attack, try to exchange the bishops. But bishop e2 is slightly passive. Knight to c3 is a more active move, but once again g6, bishop f4, bishop g7, queen d2, trying to exchange the bishop. And in these variations I like, after bishop g4, I like the idea of castling long. And this is very active for white. I think this is probably the best way, in my opinion, to fight against the Schmidt variation. But you're probably going to end up exchanging the queens after d takes e5, so nothing major once again. After knight b6, ed6 is another move, cd6, bishop d3. This is probably the safest way to play, just developing as soon as possible and getting rid of your weakness. g6, castles, bishop g7, rook e1. Castles, sort of a textbook position. Nothing huge going on for both sides, but once again you have to remember that black is lacking his knight on f6, which is the main defender, so some chances for white. And the main line in the Schmidt variation is a4, provoking the move a5. If black doesn't play a5, then white is slightly better. a5, bishop b5 check is the idea, c6, bishop d3. You wanted to provoke c6 for some reason, that's the main move. I'm not sure whether black having a pawn on c6 is an improvement to the last position, but bishop g4 pinning the knight, ed6, ed6, castles. I don't really know what to say about this position. I mean, the Schmidt variation might be a way to confuse your opponents with who have the white pieces, but white is better in development, white has more active pieces. Once again, black is lacking his main defender on f6, and I really don't like this variation in any case for black, so I really wouldn't recommend it. I just wanted to mention it because after knight f3, knight to b6 is the fourth popular move with 600 strong games, and the score is actually equal. White won 32% of the games, black won 31, so almost equal. So it's a playable variation, but I don't know, it doesn't seem active enough. And the last move we are going to look at is c6, sort of transposing to the bishop g4 lines in most cases, and once again not a very active move. It's a sideline for a reason. White can either play c4 or bishop e2. I like the move c4, and after knight c7, the thing with c6 is that the knight doesn't have to go to b6, so one upside. Knight c3, d takes c5, once again take with the knight, don't have weakness on e5. I mean, nothing major for either side. Black should here play knight to d7, white once again retreats his knight, and black could go for fianchetto setups. Now you could argue whether the fianchetto setup is better when the d file is semi-open and not the e file, so g6, bishop e2, sorry, bishop to e2, bishop g7, castles, castles, it's a normal game. I mean, nothing much going on. But c6 is considered to be one of the most solid responses for black. And if you play this variation with white pieces, I would recommend that you get acquainted with the queen pawn setups, which is unusual for an e4 player. And I myself used to play knight f3 setups against the Alekhine, but now I switched to c4 and the exchange variation because I find it more e4ish. And knight f3, the modern variation, is the most d4-like variation you can play against the Alekhine, because you basically get this every game, and you need to know how to play against a d4 opening. So one more thing, after c6, c4 was a sideline, bishop e2 mainly transposes, but black is allowed to take on e5, knight takes e5, bishop f5 is now the move, castles. You are going to play c4 eventually, get the same setup and play against that once more, but here white is going to go for his e6, c6 pawn structure once more. Let me just put one thing on the board. Wait. Just want to get these pawn structures in. Okay, this one. Can you see this? Okay, it's okay enough. I don't want to move around the board too much. I just wanted to show you the two most probable setups for black. So this is one of them with the semi-open C file and the fianchetto, and the other one is a Caro-Kann pawn structure, which I would like to talk about more, where black has a pawn on c6 and the pawn on e6, and the pawn structure is like this. And there's the thing about this pawn structure, it's very solid, and I think it's hard for white to break through it. That's why I would like to talk about it. And I play white against the Alekhine. I don't play it myself in tournament games, but I might play it if my opponent plays knight to f3, because this pawn structure is very easy to play. And if you play the Alekhine defense and you face the modern variation, I would recommend that you go for setups which end up in this structure. You can rewind the video once again. And the main idea is that you either get c5 in or e5 in. And once you get these moves, black is usually equal. So I think this is one of the best variations for black to face in the Alekhine. And this is why I sort of don't like playing the modern variation anymore, because I know that black can create this solid pawn structure which is really hard to break through. Thanks very much. I hope you liked the series on the Alekhine and this last video. We are going to go over the Scandinavian defense next, so e4, d5. One more very aggressive opening, one more unconventional opening, and I hope it's going to be great. I'm excited to cover the Scandinavian because I hate playing against it. And yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for the support. I appreciate all the kind comments and everything. Hope you liked the video. Stay tuned for more chess. See you later. Bye bye.